Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 4, Dragon Chapters 1 and 2. If you haven't read the other parts, then a summary is as follows of Part 3, which will cover the most important points. Izuku goes to high school, qualifying for UA's management course. His friends are in heroics, otaku, support, Mei, and general studies, Hitoshi. While Izuku focuses on his studies, Tomura is acting on his father's behalf. Otaku is in Class 1B. Izuku knows he has to make a decision, but since he's worrying about it too much, he has Hitoshi brainwash him into relaxing about it. Things go well, with Tomura instigating the USJ and the attack on the summer camp. There, things start to go wrong. Himiko recognizes Otaku by the dragon scale she has, and doesn't hurt Otaku. Unfortunately, one of the other students sees that, and this shifts suspicion to Otaku. When Kamino happens, and the rescue mission goes ahead, led by Momo, Otaku is the one student expelled. This angers Izuku, who decides to show UA what fairness is by challenging the students who got kidnapped, Katsuki and Shoto, and those on the rescue team, Momo, Denki, Tenya, Honanuki and Kirishima. When they show up to Izuku's challenge, he pounds them all into the ground and steals their quirks before running from All Might. Izuku stays with Garaki for a few days, learning about the Nomu, what they really are, and finding out that Yakuni has been sent to the Shi Hasaikai. When Izuku is put back in contact with Tomura, the first thing he notices is that Tomura has All for One. Angry, Izuku attacks and kills Tomura, strangling him in the way that Tomura said he'd never use Kali Imperium. Izuku grabs all the quirks Tomura has, before he dies, leaving Tomura to die with decay. The League watched Dragon kill their leader, but the revelation that Dragon is a teenager is too much for some of them and they leave. For the others, they agree they'll make a decision after Izuku leads them on a mission. He doesn't know what mission to lead them in. Dabi asks for a different price. Dabi asks for Izuku to return Shoto's quirk. Izuku does this, earning Dabi's loyalty. Since Izuku wants the League to see him as a true leader, he knows he has to learn more about villainy, specifically the bigger crimes, like murder. Himiko volunteers to help him and they find a target he can kill, the principal of the school where he was attacked and got a broken rib, but also this was the principal who made the report that Night Eye found, which led All Might to All for One. Izuku goes and kills the principal in cold blood, thus proving to the League that he's not just going to use them to keep his hands clean. Meanwhile, a vigilante decides that Otaku is a villain lover and targets her. He manages to gather a group of like-minded people and they attack Otaku, putting her into a coma. When Izuku finds out, he's very angry. However, the police, backed by All Might, move fast and arrested most of the group. Izuku has his mission for the League, and they raid the holding cells, getting most of the group, except for the vigilante. Izuku puts out a bounty on him and eventually someone comes forward. At about the same time, All Might finds out where the vigilante is. Izuku and All Might confront each other again, and after a brief fight, Izuku is again forced to flee and escapes, leaving the vigilante to All Might. Izuku meets Mei and Hitoshi in Otaku's hospital room, where they promise that while they might go their separate ways, they will remain friends. So, let's now begin chapters 1 and 2 of Part 4. Toshinori Yagi sat in Nezu's office. The rat hadn't been the principal when he'd attended, but there was something about the office that made him feel like a nervous teen, even if he was the #1 hero. The principal was reading his proposal. Toshinori knew it was a lie. Nezu would have already read it several times, and probably corrected the grammar, spelling, and formatting. Then he would have critically analyzed it and come to a decision. Even so, he'd make him believe he'd only read it now. Nezu put the paper down and looked at him. He tapped one finger on his desk. "You believe is that formidable?" All Might nodded. He'd already submitted his report to the Hero Public Safety Commission. He wasn't sure what they'd think of it. They probably thought he was being paranoid, but he'd discussed it with Mirai and with All for One his course of action was simple. Hunt down the man's network until he got to him. Then destroy him. With his son, it wasn't going to be that simple. Izuku had no network to speak of. He'd be building it. While that should make the job easier, Yagi knew it wasn't going to be that way. Izuku would inherit the last of his father's lieutenants and they'd keep him from making any blatant mistakes. And he seemed to be intelligent. What he didn't have in experience, he'd make up for in strength and his quirk. Did you see? The way Nezu cocked his head told Toshinori what he meant. I didn't see any evidence of their quirks, Yagi replied. He wasn't sure what that meant. Izuku had taken several quirks before he'd run from UA and they were good quirks. He should have a rudimentary understanding of how they worked. Has he passed them on? The principal mused. That was a possibility. There were enough quirkless people out there, who would do anything for a quirk. And for the quirks of those who had been in the hero course. Those who received them would no doubt swear loyalty to Izuku. They would be found, of course. The quirks Izuku had stolen were well known. Explosion, engine, electrification, hardening, half cold half hot, and creation. Anyone who received them couldn't use the quirk without giving away who it came from, but they wouldn't be able to give it back. And, what the hell would they be charged with? The usual charge would be possession of stolen items. Except a quirk was not defined as a possession. It was meant to be a part of the person. They could perhaps charge anyone who had those quirks with association with a villain, but the charge would stick, but it didn't do anything. It simply told those who were quirkless that there was someone out there who could give them a quirk. And those who ended up with the quirks were victims as well. I don't know, Toshinori said, finally. He might be keeping them for some other reason. Nezu's nose twitched and Toshinori wasn't sure what that meant. So you want to try this? The principal questioned. He nodded. You haven't found anyone you like? Nezu pressed. All Might sighed. Mirai had asked him that same question. The difference between the two was that Mirai had a candidate in mind to inherit one for all. If Nezu did, then the principal hadn't given so much as a hint as to who it could be. There were several I thought could be suitable. Could be? Nezu prompted. The rat was a stickler for meaning. Mirio is Sir Nightie's preference. Toshinori didn't answer directly. He is a fine young man, and he will be a great hero. He just didn't feel right. I am not sure he has the necessary. He paused and sighed again. If All for One was gone, then I wouldn't hesitate. I'd give one for all to Mirio, but he's not, and his son is still out there. Ah, Nezu murmured. There is a certain callousness required, he said. Yagi nodded. That was it exactly. Mirio was going to be a great hero, but right now, he didn't have the hardness that would be required to hunt down All for One's son. And Tomura Shigaraki. He might gain that hardness, and in the hunt, he'd have to, but if they could do this quickly, then there would be no need to have him learn that. Not if someone else was more suitable. I was thinking Kirishima, as well, but it's the same. Nezu nodded his understanding. That won't have changed? It might have, Yagi allowed. Having their quirks stolen would have changed them all. Ah, so that's why you included them all, Nezu murmured. All the first years who had their quirks stolen had been on All Might's list of students he wanted for his venture. I am certain that Bakugo has the fortitude, but I'm not sure he has the restraint, All Might said honestly. Nezu cocked his head slightly, indicating he agreed with the assessment. But being without his quirk? The rat suggested. May give him the push he needs to grow, Toshinori agreed. But that's also why I want to see others, he explained. With All for One's son and successor out there, whoever receives one for all must be ready to deal with them. I can't limit my choice. Not now. So why not mount an assault and capture him? Nezu asked, leaving out the fact that they didn't know where Izuku was. At some point, they would know. Why risk the next generation? This was something All Might had considered. The answer had surprised him. Gang Orca, Mount Lady, Best Jeanist, and Tiger encountered All for One, he said solemnly. Nezu nodded. They still have their quirks, even though he touched Best Jeanist. The principal caught the implications immediately. Interesting. He murmured, thinking hard. I wonder if it has to do with the time he was raised? Principal? Toshinori asked. You've told me that All for One is old, and therefore he was raised in a different time, one that had different expectations. He would have needed to be circumspect in using his quirk, and maybe that has rubbed off. Yagi shook his head emphatically. If All for One likes a quirk, he takes it, he said. Then perhaps he did not like them, Nezu suggested the obvious. Or is there some other limitation on his quirk? I don't know, All Might admitted. Gran, he sighed heavily. Gran probably would have known, but Gran was dead. When All for One had forced Tomura Shigaraki to escape, Gran had been thrown through the portal as well. He hadn't survived. There might be a limitation, but if there is, Izuku's quirk does not seem to share it, and so I believe people would hesitate. He gave the assessment honestly. The principal gestured to indicate that was a reasonable assessment. And the children won't? They haven't learned that they aren't invincible yet. The rat mused. I don't want to use that against them, Toshinori objected. Except he knew he was. But because they have seen what Izuku has done to their peers, they could see it happening to themselves, but they will also be more driven to deal with him. To do that, I believe we are going to need more than just UA students. This isn't a problem for UA, it's a problem for all heroes. Nezu thought about that for a moment, but All Might knew he was thinking of other issues. And the divisions between the schools are holding us back, he said. Toshinori looked slightly sheepish but nodded. We can't afford to be divided on anything, because he will exploit that. If he doesn't, one of his lieutenants will. All Might sighed. I hope I'm being paranoid. I really hope, that all the preparation isn't needed, but... He remembered chasing All for One. Ferreting out each piece of information and striking when he found All for One's network. He remembered, far too many times, when he'd been too late to act. It took him over 30 years to find All for One. If it took that long this time. They couldn't let Izuku be free for that long. Nezu thought for a while longer. The silence stretched between them until finally, the rat nodded. I'll support it, he said. Yagi felt himself relax. He hadn't been aware of how tense he'd been about the decision until the stress disappeared. With Nezu backing his idea. While it wasn't guaranteed to be accepted, it had far more chance of succeeding. As the number one hero, his promotion of the idea would help, but having the number one hero school backing it as well would be beneficial. How many students from each school? Nezu asked, immediately moving into practicalities. His idea was to gather the top hero students from each facility in Japan, to have them train together. Izuku and Tomura represented a new wave of villains, and rather than just wait for them to strike. Toshinori wanted to be on the front foot. It would also help to regain public trust in UA and heroes in general. The new heroes would form the bulwark to guard society. Just their best 2 or 3, from any year level, Toshinori replied immediately. They were heading into the second half of the first year. The teachers would have an idea of who was going to be great, even at this early stage. I want to offer a place to all the rescue squad. He added. Even those Izuku took their quirk. Darn it. All Might stopped himself. He was thinking of them only as their quirk, which was one of the problems Izuku had pointed out with society. He had to stop that. They were people, not their quirk. It will be harder for them, Nezu noted. They have the most to gain, Yagi countered. It might sound arrogant, but it was true. Will you retire now or when you pass on One for All? That was a question Toshinori didn't like. He wanted to retire now. While it could be seen as a benefit, a triumph. But the commission was afraid of what would happen and what signal that would send to villains. They thought his retirement would embolden them. He thought they were already emboldened by Tomura and Izuku's very public actions. All for One had apparently kept some of them under control. It was rather disconcerting to know that. When we begin, he indicated. I will retire to devote my full attention to teaching. The principal nodded. It was a fair compromise, and while the public would be dismayed, they would be pleased to know that All Might was teaching the next generation. Endeavor would not be happy, but ever since he found out about All Might's injuries, nothing had made him happy. He wanted to gain the top spot against an All Might who was at full strength, and he knew that was never going to happen. Whether he knew it or not, it hadn't been going to happen for the last few years. In that manner, Endeavor had a surprisingly fair streak, though it was more likely he wanted absolutely no question about his right to the number one position when he took it. All Might retiring was not how he wished to claim it. It will take some time to set up, Nezu indicated. This is a high school initiative, Yagi replied, showing his understanding. They could probably set it up within a week, if they accepted the commission overseeing and wanting control over everything. Technically that was their job, just not to the level they were. In recent years, they had become far more authoritative, going into areas they had previously let regulate themselves. I'll keep you informed, Nezu said, waving one paw. This might be Yagi's proposal, but it would be UA who made it work. And while he did think the number one hero was being slightly paranoid, he had learned that it was better to be safe than sorry, especially with new villains. They could be so unpredictable, and with Izuku, unpredictable could be truly dangerous. The principal was also disappointed. He'd looked at Izuku's grades, and while the teen was not a genius, he definitely didn't think like the other students. It might be the influence of his father, but he couldn't help but feel he could have had a few interesting conversations with the teen. Finding someone who had a genuinely different view of the world and the arguments to back it up was rare. The opportunity had been lost. Izuku's father probably had similar views, but he was in Tartarus. That was such a waste. Overhaul rolled the vial between his fingers. The liquid inside was clear, but to his eyes seemed blue. That was the effect of the vial. In his other hand he held a case. It held a series of vials and a space for a larger tube. The vial spaces were filled, with each vial being a successive shade of darker blue, nestled in the black velvet lining. The tube space was empty. He looked to chronostasis in askance. The serum still needs some work, he explained. But the bullets? Chronostasis nodded, and Kai felt a smile cross his features. They were getting closer. The new guy, the one who used to be loyal to All for One, had been a great help. While quirkless, he actually had some lab training, which meant he had refined some of their processes. "What's the time on each of the bullets?" he asked, pointing to the vials. The new guy insisted that it varies, but a day, a week, 2 weeks, and then permanent. "He says he can probably mix up a month if wanted," Chronostasis said. "I'll keep that in mind," Kai said, putting back the light-colored vial and pulling out the darkest one. They'd need a better color coding system for them. The permanent ones would have to be red. Something to indicate that they were permanent. He held the vial up to the light. The liquid reflected the light but did nothing more. He smiled. The weapon was nearly ready. And once it was, it wouldn't matter if All for One returned. It wouldn't matter what Dragon said, it would be the Shihasaikai who were in control. He'd sell the first bullets cheap, just to prove that they worked. He doubted they'd be used on anyone important. So the serum would also be cheap. And he'd be able to make use of the temporary bullets as well. They would be his proof of concept sales. Once everyone knew it worked, he'd let it be known he had permanent bullets. Then he'd watch the villains scramble to get them. And the heroes would be frantic to pay him off. They'd want to arrest him. He wasn't stupid. But they wouldn't be able to. Not when arresting him meant that they would be permanently without their quirks. In some way, he really should thank that UA student. All for One's son. He'd established the thought that quirks could be taken. Now, he would capitalize on the idea. He put the vial back and snapped the case closed. "Get the permanent bullets cased in red," Kai ordered. "They'd need that visual delineation." "I'll go work on the serum," he added. "And, get me 3 permanent bullets." 3? Chronostasis said the number as confirmation, but Kai knew he was curious as to who they were for. He held up the case. "This is going to make everyone realize the Yakuza were never gone," Kai reminded him. "But to ensure we remain at the top." "Ah, there's a few that must be removed," Chronostasis finished for him. Kai nodded. All for One was in Tartarus, and while no one had ever escaped, there was still Tomura Shigaraki and All for One's son. They were the two who would most likely be on the receiving end of these bullets, and unless they were very, very nice. All for One's time was over. It was the Shihasaikai's time to rule. They'd acknowledge that. One way, or another. Izuku looked around the bar Kurogiri had found for them to move into. He gave the Misty Man a rather ironic smile. It seemed familiar. "You like bars," he commented. "They are useful spaces," the warp gate defended. Izuku laughed. "It's fine," he dismissed the need to be defensive. "Is there enough space here?" "It used to be a hostel, so there is room upstairs," Kurogiri told him, pointing to a very narrow set of stairs coming off from a corner. They disappeared into darkness. "Then let's set up here," he decided. They'd been living in a warehouse for the last few weeks. It was one where Yakuni appeared to be copying quirks. Warehouses had some advantages when you were hiding from the authorities. There were lots of them being one of the key advantages, but they had some really big disadvantages when people couldn't go anywhere. There was no privacy. Facilities were rudimentary and being large. Open spaces, they were freezing in winter, and stiflingly hot in summer. The cold could be dealt with by extra blankets, but they were not comfortable. This would be much better. Each of his companions, the villains who had been gathered to aid Tomura, could have their own space, but they would still be living together and hopefully learning to work together. He was going to have to make sure that was something they practiced. But that was an issue for tomorrow. First, they had to move in and then plan. "I will need stock," Kurogiri announced, walking to the bar. There were a few, very dusty glasses, on the wall behind it, but no alcohol. Izuku asked. Yellow eyes turned to him. "The main risk with the warehouse is people coming and going when people are not meant to be there. It is the same here. We will need customers to ensure that we blend," he explained. Izuku nodded. That made sense. He'd never thought about it growing up, but it made a lot of sense. "Will there be enough passing traffic?" he asked. The Misty Man nodded. "This is not the best neighborhood," he observed. At that, Izuku snorted lightly. There were so many conclusions that could be drawn from that statement, but the one that was important to him was firmly rooted in the socio-economic class of the neighborhood. Upmarket neighborhoods tended to get more hero activity. The central business district and shopping areas were awash with heroes, especially during times when the public was present. They had a reasonable amount of hero presence in the downtimes too. But neighborhoods like this one didn't see as much activity. They might see new heroes or underground heroes. That could be their biggest threat actually. Underground heroes tended to actually want to be heroes, and they had been a threat all his life, Izuku realized. He'd have to deal with it when something materialized. He looked around. "Would it damage anything if I blow the dust out?" he asked. Kurogiri gave him an odd look before he understood what he was asking. He then moved behind the bar, took the non-broken glasses down, and secured them, before moving to open a side door. From the angle, Izuku knew it went into an alleyway. It was probably the emergency fire exit. Then Kurogiri moved to stand next to him. "It should be okay now," he indicated unnecessarily. Izuku grinned and focused. Kali Imperium wasn't actually a wind quirk, but he could give that impression. It allowed him to manipulate nitrogen. He couldn't change the chemical composition, so he couldn't change the nitrogen in the air into ammonia or something like that. But he could make the nitrogen in the air act as a physical barrier. That was often good enough for his purposes. So now, he concentrated on brushing the nitrogen in the air over the bar surfaces, picking up the dust, and throwing it out the door. It took a few minutes, but already the place looked cleaner, even if it now smelt extra musty. "What's upstairs like?" Izuku asked. "It's not too bad," Kurogiri replied. "It hasn't been abandoned long." That was good. They could clear up the beds and use the rooms. He'd get in furniture if he needed, but the budget was better without that need. It was a good thing he'd had a bit of experience living by himself to get used to budgeting. "We should probably get some food before moving everyone over," Izuku mused. Kurogiri nodded. "I'll get it," Izuku said, "if you can move them over." He added. The Misty Man nodded again and closed the outside door. "There's a shop down the road," he said, and there was something in his tone that took Izuku by surprise. He gave the warp gate a sharp look. "Just make sure you don't offend them," Kurogiri advised. For a moment Izuku didn't understand, but then he nodded. The store was probably one of the hubs of the local community. For them to pass unnoticed, they had to fit in with them. He reached up and roughed up his hair a little as he changed it to a black color. It would be nice if the color change quirk also included length and style, but it was just color. He let his eyes turn brown. "I'll be nice," he reassured the warp gate as he went to the front door and slipped out. They needed this base, so he wasn't going to make mistakes, and if they did it right? Izuku let a small smile play around his features. If they did this right, they could come to be seen as the neighborhood protectors. And that would be a great advantage. It wouldn't guarantee people didn't sell them out, but it would help. He'd be nice now. He'd be really nice now. It was hard to be casual when one of the checkout ladies was staring at him. Izuku had gotten to the store, picked out a trolley, and then started getting the stuff they'd need when he noticed her staring. She was doing her job, but she was staring at him intensely every time he came down to that end of the small shop. It was disconcerting. He didn't sense any hostility from her, just intense curiosity. He shook his head and kept shopping. It was kind of relaxing. This was a problem that was easily solved. He went for cheaper things that he could get in bulk and was thankful that he had a strength quirk that would help him carry everything. Eventually though, it came time to check out and Izuku deliberately went to the cashier lady who was staring at him. Thankfully she didn't let the fact that she was staring impact her job, but halfway through putting the groceries through, she smiled at him. "It is you," she said softly. Izuku braced. He wasn't used to being wanted, but he knew when she said that she could be referring to anything. His picture had been well circulated thanks to the Yaoyorozus. He gave her a quizzical look. She seemed to understand what it meant because she chuckled, and reached towards the fruit he'd put at the back of the conveyor belt. "I don't care about UA," she told him conversationally. "I just want to thank you," she said, holding up the bag of mandarins. That jolted his memory and Izuku felt his eyes go wide. "You're okay," he said with a smile as he remembered her. She was the lady he'd helped in the alley, though he'd done practically nothing. He'd simply directed her to a shelter and given her some mandarins. She smiled back, looking far more peaceful than the last time he'd seen her. "I am," she confirmed. "You remembered me from that?" Izuku asked. All he'd done was give her some fruit and the location of the shelter. That was hardly anything. He looked at her name tag. It said Komoni. Izuku got the impression she was biting her lip as she looked at him. Her eyes went watery. "It might have been nothing to you," she told him in a voice that trembled. "But it was everything to me." He wasn't sure what to say to that. Eventually he settled on something neutral. "So it worked out?" Komoni nodded, as she kept putting his groceries through. "Yes. Now I have this job," and she smiled. It seemed satisfied. "Things are looking up." "I'm glad to hear it," he replied. "And for you?" Komoni asked, giving him a look that said she wasn't asking about his legitimate interests. She was aware he was wanted and he only hoped she didn't plan to sell him out. He should run. He should do something, but Izuku realized he'd just have to wait to find out what happened. Right now he had no idea who he could trust. He shook his head in a way that indicated his uncertainty. Komoni chuckled as she packed the last of the groceries into a bag. "Could go either way?" She interpreted his gesture. "Could go either way," Izuku confirmed, tapping his phone to the pay point. "Well, if you ever need something," she told him. "I may not be able to do much, but I owe you, Izuku, so if you need something, I will try." He just stared at her for a few moments, trying to work out what she was saying before he nodded. He had no idea what he could possibly need from her, but it was better to have allies than enemies. He started and then huffed. Again Izuku stopped, trying to collect his thoughts. "I'm not sure what," he said finally. With a friendly nod. "But I will keep it in mind." Komoni grinned at him and nodded before she turned to the next customer. Izuku took that as his cue to leave, wheeling the trolley out and picking up all the bags before he shoved the trolley into the rack and headed back to the bar. It had been an interesting encounter, and while Komoni said she'd help him because he'd helped her, if her view was even halfway indicative of the public's, then he had more support than he thought. And that was useful. "Got food," Izuku announced as he came through the door and noticed the group was gathered in the bar. He held up the bags that without his strength quirks, even with all his training, he'd have been struggling to carry. "Izu!" Himiko cried happily and skipped over to him. "You paid for it?" Whisper asked, almost too softly to be heard. "I paid for it," he confirmed for her. "I don't want to antagonize our neighbors," he explained. He was pleased to see nods from the others. And Whisper gave him a smile that indicated she'd been fishing for the answer. "Let me put this away and then I think it's time for a proper chat," he announced. There was some curiosity about that, but Izuku held firm as he moved to the kitchen. It wasn't a domestic kitchen but one attached to the bar, that would have served snacks and serviced the hostel rooms. The fridge was built in and was still in reasonable condition. Kurogiri had turned it on. He quickly unpacked the food and, after picking out some snacks, went back to the bar. Given that they'd just opened, there was no one there but his crew. "You want to talk?" "You don't want to talk," Twice said. "I want to talk," Izuku said seriously. "What do you want to talk about?" Dabi asked. "What we are going to do." That got their attention. Izuku tossed the snacks onto the table as he took a seat. "What are we going to do, Izu?" Himiko asked. She grabbed a packet of chips and sat down too. The food gathered the others, and they picked out something to eat. Izuku sighed. "It's easy to say I want to change the world, or I want to get rid of heroes," Izuku began. "The question is, where do you start?" He let that hover in the air for a bit. Izuku looked around. They were watching him with varying degrees of interest. Tomura was never meant to be alone, Izuku told them. Or rather, his part in the plan was to agitate society, while others took advantage of the discontent to change things. What do you mean, change things? Mr. Compress asked. He sounded intrigued. What's the easiest way of getting rid of heroes? Izuku challenged. Killing them. Himiko answered. That's one way, but it's kind of slow, Izuku answered, giving her a nod. Any other ways? It has always been one of the fundamental flaws of villainy, Mr. Compress mused. We tend to focus on one particular passion at a time. Hey, Himiko objected. I just want the blood. There does tend to be a few types of what society calls villain, Izuku agreed. There always has been. Even when the word was simply criminal. He sighed and looked up at the ceiling. It was just a ceiling with a fan to move the air. There are those who steal because they have to steal to eat, and there are those who steal because they find it fun, or profitable. There are those who are called villains because they have had no choice, those who live in their passions, and those who want to achieve something. The first aren't really villains. It is simply due to circumstance, but society doesn't care about that. The second? He half shook his head, indicating that it was a complex situation. They could probably live in a more accepting society, and the third? Those are the rare type, Izuku concluded. You want to be that, you don't want to be that, Twice observed. I want to be that, Izuku confirmed. Which means I need to be honest with you and realistic about my chances. And then, when realistic, work out ways of being better. They thought about that for a while before Twice gave him a sharp look and pulled off his mask. So what exactly do you want? He asked pointedly. Izuku nodded to acknowledge the question. I want society to realize that heroes are not a benefit. That they are a self-perpetuating system that creates inequality, false prejudice, and class division. So write some papers, letters to the editor, Twice advised. Izuku grinned at the suggestion. I would if it changed anything. All that would do is gauge public opinion, which will be necessary, he allowed. Go into politics, Dabi suggested. I'm a little too young, Izuku countered. Though I had thought of that, he told the group. The Hero Public Safety Commission is, as the name suggests, a commission. It was set up by an act of parliament and is governed by that same act, he explained. If you want to change what they are doing, you just have to get parliament to agree to an amendment. While the looks he got for that information weren't blank, they weren't entirely believing either. I never said that would be easy. Izuku defended. At that, Dabi snorted, as if he'd made a joke. I don't think any of us have the temperament required to go into politics, Izuku told them with a wry grin. But it's something to consider. We haven't seen many retired heroes go into politics, but it used to be popular for retired sports stars, he explained. So you want a contact in parliament? Mr. Compress asked. I wouldn't say no, Izuku replied. There are other ways of making society change, he continued. Changing the act is the legal way. And there are two more ways I can think of. What are they? Whisper prompted when he fell silent. If you don't have someone in parliament, you have to make society want the change so that parliament does it anyway, Izuku said. That's what Tomura had been doing. Showing that heroes were ineffectual, and once people start thinking that, they start looking for their own protection. That's good in one way, but bad in others. If the government is decent, before it gets too far, they will address the citizens' concerns. No government is that good, Twice told him. Some have been, Izuku replied, giving him an ironic smile and shrugging. But I'm not sure ours is, which leaves us with the third way of making a change. Izuku looked around. Atsuhiro gave him a mocking smile and Himiko giggled. He thought they knew what he was talking about. Dabi frowned and Twice looked intrigued while Whisper was thinking. Hostile takeover, Izuku announced, ignoring the drama inherent in the words. A coup? A coup. Izuku agreed. There's a couple of ways of doing them too. If parliament won't change, and society supports you, then it should be pretty easy. It's what comes after that is difficult. And if parliament and society are against you, then you just need more force. They've all been done in the past. Which way do you want, Izu? Himiko asked. I'd prefer with the support of society, Izuku told them. It's easier, and you have more tolerance when you make changes afterwards. But you'll use force if you have to? Dabi suggested. I will, Izuku agreed. But that could be akin to a civil war. Japan had fought several civil wars over its history and no one really wanted to repeat them. Though maybe there will be opportunities to be more creative. Twice frowned. What do you mean? I don't really want to instigate or fight a civil war, Izuku said. It would leave Japan weakened, and there are those who'd take advantage of that. But maybe we could create a separate society? He suggested with a shrug, but even as he said it he realized something. What is it? Himiko asked, seeing his change in expression. I might be thinking about this in the wrong way, Izuku said slowly. While society has some issues, they are perpetuated by heroes. Yes, we know that. Heroes are the problem, Himiko told him. Yes, they are a problem, but if we try to attack all of society, then all of society will be against us, Izuku said. We don't want that, he said with a self-deprecating chuckle. The fastest way to get the public offside is to look like you are going to take away their comfortable life. If that was the threat, then everyone would be against us. I don't want that. What I want, what I think we all really want is heroes gone, and with them, the support structure. You want to kill the support industry? Mr. Compress asked. No. I want the commission, Izuku corrected. I don't have a problem with social services, the tax commission, finance, foreign affairs, and all those, he explained, listing off parts of the government. It's really only the Hero Public Safety Commission which is the issue. And heroes. So? That means we must ensure we are targeted in what we do. We have to make sure the public knows we aren't against them, we are against those who claim to have their best interests at heart, those who claim to be for their safety, but who really don't care, so long as they get their action shot or their good propaganda. We have to show that heroes and the commission aren't needed, are corrupt, obsolete or whatever works. He finished with a grin. The group was silent again, understanding what he was saying. Finally, Dabi sighed heavily. Well, that's going to be the trick then, right? Making sure we pick our targets, he elaborated. Yeah, Izuku agreed with a huff. So, anyone know how to do that? He looked around. There was silence once again. This was going to be hard. End. The Emperor's Dragon Part 4, Dragon, Chapters 1 and 2. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe. Join me for the next chapters. Or check out my other works.